you discussing the films that Bhagat Singh like. Now, I actually hadn't written this down, but it's come to me just while we were talking, which is like I remember being a child, and one of the, well, when I say a child, a bit younger, and I just remember watching for the first time The Legend of Bhagat Singh, which is kind of like obviously a very, very famous film, and it's actually now on YouTube free to watch completely, which I thought is quite incredible. And I started watching it the other day, and I think actually that's what led me to end up reading the paper, because I was like, why? Because I know there are obviously historical inaccuracies, but I was also just like, I'm going to waste 2 hours watching this. Let me read something instead. So anyway, ended up to your paper, and here we are. My question is, how accurately does the media portray, like, that film can be an example, and I'm sure there are plenty of others, but like, how accurately does the media portray who Bhagat Singh is? Or is it, or as you were saying like earlier, because he died so young, there is huge scope to kind of reimagine him almost?
I think maybe you should spend 2 hours watching films on YouTube. Much more rewarding. In the film that I absolutely loved is Rang the Basanti, which is a bit more recent, but now increasingly not so. And that's a film which takes a lot of creative license with the HRSA story, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad. But I think that film tells us a lot about how it's possible to, like you said, what can be done with Bhagat Singh, because we've seen a lot. I mean, you can see across South Asia a number of different ways of taking him up. So there is, I mean, sometimes you find that Bhagat Singh appears in RSS documents and very far right, very horrifyingly xenophobic. Like he's kind of a hero within that tradition. I couldn't tell you how that gets worked out, the mathematics of that, because he's so young, because he kind of foregrounds his process and his learning, and in that he's still learning, and his ambivalence about all of these kind of various political forms. He's very easy to take up by any number of people. So, so the far right can take him and make him a hero. The far left can take him and make him a hero. He has something to say, or he has, you can find something somewhere in Bhagat Singh's writing to support that your claim that you want. I think Rang the Basanti gives us a good example of precisely how adaptable his afterlife, his legacy is, because it foregrounds that it's imagined. We romanticize that scene, which sort of didn't exist for Bhagat Singh, it existed for Chandrasekhar Azad, of the shootout with the police. Right, we kind of imagine that moment where Bhagat Singh throws the bomb into the assembly and yells "Inqilab Zindabad." Right, I mean, all of these moments are really great for taking a Bhagat Singh that we want and making him into who we want. And I think to go back to what you said earlier, it's precisely in some ways that he died so young, that youth was such a motivating factor for him, that it makes him especially adaptable to any sort of reading. I think for me, I think that's why it's all the more important to go back to do our best to go back to that moment where he's writing, and to remind ourselves that he's 20, to remind ourselves that his citations are in formation, to remind ourselves that to remind ourselves that we were once 20 and we were not as clear thinkers as Bhagat Singh. I certainly, but to foreground that as part of Bhagat Singh's process and legacy seems to be a way of guarding off, that kind of infinitely adaptable afterlife that he seems to be able to take. I mean, I would be curious to hear more. Like, I mean, how do kind of Sikh insurgency movements after 1945 pick up this, the martyrdom of Bhagat Singh?
I think what's interesting is because of the fact, and this is partly why I wanted to do this podcast, is because there is not a confusion. I think there's an ambivalence towards Bhagat Singh because of the fact that he declares, I know we've discussed it, but just going back to like the general knowledge, he declares he's an atheist. And I think unless you kind of do dig a little bit deeper and kind of figure out what's really going on, you take it for face value. So I think for some, there's an ambivalence because he's not taking up the fight directly under the banner of Sikhism, if that makes sense. Whereas a lot of the insurgency, especially from the 70s onwards, is directly declaring it under the banner of the Sikh Brotherhood, so to speak. And so it's not to say he's not accepted. Like, he is widely celebrated on his Shahidi Day, as we would call it, on his martyrdom day, equally on his birthday. And that's also, I guess, because he's the son of Punjab. Like, he's seen as coming from the soil, just like Udham Singh. And again, what's interesting is they're accepted as martyrs or as shaheeds within the Sikh tradition, although they themselves, for like this is just talking in kind of general, they themselves haven't taken on the whole Sikh garb, if that makes sense. So they're not like, they cut their hair. Udham Singh is I think when he's hung or whatever, like he's started to grow his hair back. But Bhagat Singh, like he's like his photo, the famous photos of him is in a mustache with his hat on, right? Like when you think of a Sikh, you don't think of that per se. So I think that has had an influence on how much he's been accepted. But I think that's also, if like being quite frank, I think that's also a disservice because it's not actually appreciating him in his context. Like, and actually the other thing is even the insurgency post independence, especially during the 70s and 80s, there are loads of people who take up the call to arms, who also are Sikh, but don't necessarily visually keep a turban or grow their beard. So it's just interesting to see how almost allegiance to the philosophical outview almost dictates how much then they're accepted or not. But it's very overlapping, because they're also accepted because they're from Punjab. They're also accepted because they're fighting colonial oppression. They're not necessarily then accepted because in Bhagat Singh's case, he declares he's an atheist. And so, yeah, hopefully with this podcast, we can kind of make people think a little bit more, and maybe perhaps like we'll change something, or somebody somewhere will think twice about this.
You're right. The most famous picture of Bhagat Singh is the mustache and the jewelry. I would say maybe the second most famous picture of Bhagat Singh is when he's in jail and he's wrapping his turban. I mean, he's growing his hair back, and so he retains a commitment to Sikhism, and there are ways that could kind of foregrounded in iconography of him after his death. But I mean, you're absolutely right that there's this kind of weird tension between the trilby wearing kind of white earring, Bhagat Singh, and the devout, I mean, the kind of fairly devout Bhagat Singh in jail, who is practicing. I'm going to blank on the author, but then there's a long tradition within Judaism of Jewish thinkers. The Jewish thinkers that we kind of go to think Judaism were themselves kind of ambivalent about Judaism. So, I mean, there's a book called The Non-Jewish Jew, which is very much about this kind of the key figures of iconography of a kind of interpretive tradition within Judaism were a little bit on the fringe, had half a foot out the door, or were contemplating it. I think maybe, I mean, that you might, I wonder if the same case might be made for Sikhism, that the kind of most vibrant thinkers of Sikhism had a sort of ambivalent, or appear to have a sort of ambivalent relationship to Sikhism. So you don't, which makes them really vibrant thinkers. They can think the contours of what Sikhism can do. They can think about the porous contours of its practices, and that makes, I mean, that in some ways, so the canon of thinkers isn't at the center, but rather at the periphery.